In the winter of 1922, on a night in early February, a young friar at San Giovanni Rotondo knocked on Padre Pio's cell door at 2 in the morning because he had heard something that alarmed him. Not the usual sounds of demonic attack, the crashes, the thrown furniture, the cries of pain that everyone in the friary had grown grimly accustomed to. Silence, an unusual, total, heavy silence, of the kind that feels like something is wrong rather than nothing at all. He opened the door. Padre Pio was not in the room. The bed was empty. The window was closed from the inside. The door had been locked from within. The cell was empty in the way a room is empty when someone has been removed from it by something that does not use doors. The friar stood in the doorway for several minutes, unsure what to do, unsure whether to wake anyone else, unsure whether what he was witnessing was an absence or a presence too subtle for him to perceive. At approximately 4 in the morning, Padre Pio was found on his knees in the corner of his cell, face down, both hands covering his face, weeping with a depth that the friar described in his testimony as unlike anything he had witnessed in a human being before or since. When asked what had happened, Padre Pio did not speak for over 2 hours. When he finally did speak, he said only 4 words to his superior, Father Benedetto, who had been summoned. "I have been shown." This is what truly matters, and I say it as someone who has spent more than 60 years trying to understand Catholicism not just as doctrine, but as encounter. The reality of hell is not a theological instrument of fear. It is the outer boundary of the same reality that makes love meaningful at all. If nothing can be lost, nothing can be given. And Padre Pio understood this not from theology books, but from the experience I'm about to share with you. And I have to say plainly, I was not prepared the first time I read these accounts in full for what they contained. I thought I was prepared. I was not. There is something that most practicing Catholics carry quietly, never quite knowing how to speak about it, a weight that accumulates over the years, usually attached to specific names and specific faces. A grandmother who stopped going to Mass 20 years before her death and never returned. A son who left the church at 18 and died in an accident at 32, still distant from it. A husband whose final months were shadowed by dementia, who received the last sacraments, but who had lived for decades in a state of practiced indifference to the faith. A friend you prayed for every day for 30 years, whose face you still hold in your mind at the moment after the consecration, whose salvation you have never stopped hoping for, never quite been able to stop worrying about. And the question underneath all of it, never asked out loud because asking it feels like a failure of faith or a failure of hope or simply too frightening to let into the air of the conversation, is this: where are they? Not as a theological abstraction, as real people with real voices and real histories and real faces, whose final spiritual state is genuinely unknown to those who loved them most. Padre Pio spent 50 years answering versions of this question in the confessional, in spiritual direction, in the rare moments when he agreed to speak about what he knew of the life that follows this one. And he carried, from the winter of 1922 onward, a particular weight about the subject of hell that those who knew him intimately said never entirely left him. He had been shown, and the account of what he was shown, preserved in his letters to Father Benedetto, in the testimony of the friars who served alongside him, in the documentation gathered for his beatification process, is what today's video is about. Stay with me. Because what haunted Padre Pio about what he saw was not what you think. And the most important thing he brought back from that vision, the one instruction he gave repeatedly to everyone he directed in the years that followed, is something you can act on today. To understand the account I am about to share, you need to know 3 things about Padre Pio in the early 1920s. First, the demonic attacks on his physical body which had been occurring with escalating intensity since the appearance of the stigmata in September 1918, had by 1922 settled into a grim regularity that the Capuchin community at San Giovanni Rotondo had learned to endure. There were nights of violence, furniture thrown, Padre Pio beaten by forces that no one could see, wounds appearing on his body that had no physical cause, reported by multiple witnesses and documented in the friary's records. There were also apparitions of a different kind, radiant rather than terrifying, offering what Padre Pio described as a quality of presence that was the exact opposite of the demonic. As if the room contained its own sun, he wrote, one that cast no shadow and left no heat, only a clarity that made everything more itself. Among these radiant visits, Padre Pio described, in letters to his spiritual directors, beginning in his early years as a priest, appearances of Saint Francis of Assisi, the founder of the Franciscan order to which the Capuchins belong, on several occasions. These were not emotional consolations or vague feelings of spiritual warmth. Padre Pio described them with the same matter-of-fact precision he brought to everything. Specific words spoken, specific instructions given, specific theological content that could be verified against the tradition. Father Benedetto, his spiritual director, had learned over years to trust the quality of Padre Pio's reporting on these experiences precisely because it never embellished, never dramatized, and always contained something of genuine theological substance that Padre Pio could not have constructed himself from his own limited formal education. Second, you need to know the theological context. The Catholic Church has always understood that visions of hell, purgatory, and heaven are genuine possibilities in the mystical life, not required, not universal, but attested from the earliest centuries and across every spiritual tradition within Catholicism. What the Church calls intellectual visions are experiences in which the soul is granted genuine knowledge of spiritual realities that cannot be obtained through the senses or through ordinary theological reasoning. The experiences of Hildegard of Bingen, Catherine of Siena, John of the Cross, and in the 20th century Signor Faustina Kowalska all include this kind of direct knowledge of the afterlife. They are neither dreams nor hallucinations. They are understood, when carefully authenticated, as genuine encounters with spiritual reality. Encounters whose content can be evaluated against scripture, tradition, and the lived theological understanding of the Church. Third, you need to know about Father Benedetto of San Marco in Lamis, who was, at this time, Padre Pio's principal spiritual director. Father Benedetto was a man of rigorous theological formation, deeply skeptical of spiritual claims that outstripped their documentation, and for that very reason, one of the most important figures in the preservation of Padre Pio's mystical legacy. When Padre Pio came to him with the account of the night in February 1922, Father Benedetto asked him 17 specific questions across 3 days. The answers to those questions, which Padre Pio gave carefully in writing, in the exchange of letters that constitutes the 3rd volume of the published correspondence, form the primary source document for everything I'm about to tell you. These letters are real, they are archived, they were examined in the beatification process, and their content is what follows. Hold on, because before I describe what Padre Pio saw, I need to tell you who took him there, and when I tell you which saint was his guide that night, it will change the way you hear everything that follows, because the saint who brought Padre Pio to witness hell was not one of the great visionary mystics known for descriptions of the spiritual world. It was not Catherine of Siena, whose visions of hell are among the most documented in the Church's history. It was not John of the Cross, whose spiritual writing mapped the interior landscape with extraordinary precision. It was the man whose example Padre Pio had shaped his entire life around, from the day he entered the Capuchin novitiate as a teenager. The saint of poverty, simplicity, and joy, the saint who kissed lepers and preached to birds, who wept with such tenderness for human suffering that he bore the wounds of Christ in his own hands and feet and side. It was St. Francis of Assisi. And the fact that this gentle, luminous presence was the one chosen to show Padre Pio the place of ultimate separation from God is itself the first piece of interpretation that the vision provides. This was not a vision designed to terrorize. It was a vision designed to teach a confessor what he needed to understand about the souls he was about to spend a lifetime hearing. Padre Pio described the beginning of the vision to Father Benedetto with a precision that the older priest found unusual, even in a man accustomed to reporting extraordinary spiritual experiences. He wrote, "I became aware that I was somewhere else, not in sleep and not in waking, but in that condition of the soul where it is most itself, without the weight of the body, but with all its faculties, more sharply present than in ordinary consciousness. St. Francis was before me. He was, I find no better word, luminous, not like a lamp, but like a clear window in bright daylight. The light came through him, not from him. He said, 'Come. There is something you need to see in order to understand what you are fighting.' What followed, as Padre Pio described it, had no motion in the ordinary sense. No walking down corridors, no descending stairways, the kind of imagery medieval accounts used because it was the only conceptual vocabulary available to them. What Padre Pio described was more like a progressive revelation of something that was already present but not yet visible, like the development of a photograph, the image appearing gradually out of the chemical bath of expanded spiritual perception, becoming more defined and more overwhelming as the minutes or hours, he could not tell which, passed. The first thing he described was the absence. He wrote, "I have known in my life many kinds of silence, and I have valued them. The silence of the early morning in the friary, the silence of prayer, the silence after the consecration, but this was different from all of them. This was silence as deprivation rather than silence as gift. The silence of a room that has always been empty. The silence that is not waiting for something to arrive because it has forgotten what waiting is." Within that silence, Padre Pio described a quality of existence that he struggled, in his letters, to articulate accurately enough to satisfy Father Benedetto's precise questions. It was not pain in the way he understood pain from the stigmata, that sharp, specific, located suffering of wounds in flesh. It was what he called il dolore dell'assenza, the pain of absence, the specific anguish of a soul that was made for union with God and would experience every moment of eternity as the complete, unrelieved consciousness of being permanently separated from the one thing it was made for. He wrote, "I understood for the first time what damnation actually means. Not that God punishes by inflicting suffering from outside, but that the soul created for love, deprived of love forever, becomes its own most terrible torment. Not because God withdraws from it in anger, but because it has withdrawn from God so completely and so finally that it can no longer receive what he is still, even now, offering." This understanding aligns precisely with what the Catechism of the Catholic Church teaches and with the theological position of nearly every major Catholic thinker, from Augustine to Benedict XVI. Hell is not primarily a place of external punishment. It is the natural consequence of a soul that has finally and irrevocably completed its own direction away from God. What makes Padre Pio's description distinctive is not its theology, but its intensity as direct experiential witness. He did not know this as a proposition. He knew it as an encounter, and the encounter was with specific souls. There is one more element of the early part of the vision that Padre Pio described, and that I want to include here, because Father Benedetto marked it in his notes as the most theologically precise observation in the entire account. Padre Pio described a specific quality in the souls he witnessed that he had no prepared language for, and that required several revisions in his letters before Father Benedetto was satisfied that the description was accurate. He called it la fissità, the fixedness. He wrote, "They are not in torment in the way that the body suffers when it is hurt. The suffering is not something that comes and goes, that rises to a peak and subsides. It is a condition, not an event. It is the permanent state of a consciousness that was made for movement, for growth, for conversion, for the ongoing journey toward God, and has arrived at a point from which there is no further movement possible. The suffering is the stillness itself, the absolute impossibility of being different from what they have finally become." He described this fixedness as visually apparent, not as a metaphor, but as a genuinely perceived quality of those souls in the vision. They did not seem to be reaching or striving or even writhing, as popular imagination often pictures the damned. They seemed, in the word he used several times, settled, permanently settled into the shape that a lifetime of choices had created. And this, he wrote, was the most frightening thing about the vision. Not the intensity of any suffering he witnessed, but the completeness of the settlement. The absolute absence of unfinished business, of unresolved potential, of any remaining possibility of being otherwise. St. Francis walked alongside Padre Pio through the vision and said very little, according to the account. Padre Pio wrote that when his guide spoke, it was in short, plain sentences, without elaboration, as if the things being said did not require decoration because they were simply accurate. At one point, when Padre Pio found himself overwhelmed and began to turn away from what he was seeing, St. Francis said, and Padre Pio underlined this in his letter, "Look, you need to be able to speak about this accurately, not often. But when the soul in front of you needs it, you need to have seen it." And then St. Francis said something that Padre Pio recorded word for word. "None of them arrived here suddenly. All of them arrived gradually, through choices that each one made freely, and each of which seemed at the time it was made smaller than it actually was." Padre Pio described to Father Benedetto, with careful reticence about names and details, several types of soul he encountered in that vision. He did not describe monsters. He did not describe souls who looked like the villains of popular imagination. He described, in words that Father Benedetto wrote, were among the most disturbing he had ever received from his spiritual son, souls that he recognized, not by name, for the most part, by type, by the particular spiritual configuration that he had spent years learning to read in the confessional, the soul consumed by the inability to love, not because it had no capacity for love, but because it had spent its entire earthly life directing that capacity exclusively toward itself, and had now become permanently what it had been becoming incrementally. The soul deformed by resentment that had been nursed for so long that the resentment had eaten through every other faculty, so that it no longer even remembered what it was resenting, only the shape of the resenting itself, preserved in permanent rigidity. The soul calcified by a particular kind of pride, not the dramatic Luciferian pride of open rebellion, but the quiet, persistent pride of a person who had spent 60 or 70 years being unwilling to be wrong, unwilling to be needy, unwilling to receive what they had not already decided they deserved, and who stood now in eternity in a posture of permanent refusal that they no longer had the spiritual faculty to question. But here is what no one expected. Here is what the accounts describe as the thing that affected Padre Pio most deeply. that brought him to his knees weeping, that Father Benedetto called the element of your account that I am least able to put into pastoral language without feeling I am doing damage to its precision. Because the vision he received in 1922 was not populated primarily by the worst cases. It was not filled primarily with people who had committed great public crimes against God and humanity. What Padre Pio saw, and what he returned to most often in the years that followed when he spoke about this at all, was something he had not expected to encounter there in such frequency, what he called le anime di cera, the souls of wax. Souls that had started with good material, genuine faith, genuine reception of the sacraments, genuine devotion, practiced over years, people who had been to Mass for decades, people who had said the Rosary, people who had done genuine acts of charity and genuine acts of service, but who had, over a long lifetime, made a series of choices. None of them catastrophic looking on any given day, none of them dramatic enough to register as a definitive rejection of God, that had slowly, incrementally, redirected the orientation of their souls from God toward themselves. Until at the moment of final choice, the motion was entirely in one direction and had been for so long that reversing it would have required something they could no longer conceive of wanting. I've seen this pattern, not in hell. I don't claim any sight beyond this life, but in the nursing homes and hospitals where I worked for years in Coventry, I saw people in their final weeks, and I noticed something I couldn't explain until I read accounts like this one. There was a difference, visible to anyone paying close attention, between the people who had spent their lives learning to receive love, grace, help, forgiveness, all of it, and the people who had spent their lives managing those things. The managers were the ones who were frightened in the end. Not always the worst people, sometimes very decent, very respectable people. People whose Catholic practice was genuinely consistent and genuinely sincere, but people who had never quite learned to let go of the administration of their own spiritual life. And in those final weeks, when everything was being taken away and there was nothing left to administer, they didn't know what to do with what remained. And then St. Francis showed Padre Pio something that the testimony records as the most disturbing element of the entire vision. He showed him the moment of final refusal. Padre Pio witnessed in the mystical vision what Catholic theology understands as the particular judgment, the instant when the soul faces God directly and the orientation of its entire earthly life is revealed in its full reality. And what he saw, which Father Benedetto marked in his notes with the Latin phrase vide considera, look and consider, was that at that final moment, God did not withdraw. The door was open. The offer of mercy was present and real and utterly without condition, exactly as Catholic theology promises. But there were souls who, in that final instant, could not bring themselves to walk through it. Not because they didn't believe the door was there, but because walking through it would have required a movement of total surrender, a complete release of the self into the mercy of another, that they had never practiced, never cultivated, never made habitual. They had managed God's access to their lives for so long, deciding how much grace to receive and in what form and at what pace and on their own terms, that the act of unreserved surrender that the final moment required was, for them, genuinely, tragically impossible. Not because God had made it impossible, but because they had made themselves incapable of it, incrementally, through a lifetime of small choices that had felt, at the time, completely reasonable. Padre Pio wrote to Father Benedetto, "I wept, not for them in anger or in condemnation. I wept because I could see in each of those souls the exact shape of what had been lost, and it was always the same shape. The moment, decades or years earlier, when they had first refused to need God completely. The moment they had decided to manage grace rather than receive it, everything after that was the consequence of that first small refusal, playing itself out across a lifetime until it had become the whole life. St. Francis was holding his hand during this part of the vision, Padre Pio reported, and said only, "Pray, hope, and don't worry, but pray knowing that prayer is not management. Prayer is surrender. There is a difference. You must teach people the difference." Padre Pio came back from the vision of 1922 and did not speak publicly about what he had seen for many years. When he finally did speak, it was in fragments, in responses to specific confessional questions, in comments to the friars during the ordinary hours of the day, in the spiritual direction of the people closest to him. He never wrote a comprehensive account of the vision for public circulation. What we have comes from Father Benedetto's notes, from the testimony of friars who were present across the years that followed, and from the documentation gathered for the beatification process. But the pattern of his teaching after 1922 bears the unmistakable imprint of what he had been shown. His insistence in the confessional on specific, honest, complete examination of conscience. His refusal to offer easy comfort to those who were content with the surface of their spiritual life. His particular urgency for people who had assembled a beautiful edifice of Catholic practice around an interior that had never learned the fundamental posture of receiving. And the phrase that everyone who knew him heard him use, in some form, throughout his ministry, "Pray, hope, and don't worry," was not a piece of spiritual comfort offered to the anxious. After 1922, it was a precise spiritual instruction about how to remain capable of the only movement that would matter at the very end. The soul that prays, knowing that prayer is surrender, not performance, not presentation, not the arrangement of spiritual credentials for divine inspection. That soul is forming itself, day by day, into a posture capable of the final moment. The soul that manages its prayer, manages its grace, manages God's access to its inner life. That soul is forming itself into something else, and the formation takes a long time, and it is very, very quiet. And it can happen to people who go to Mass every Sunday for 50 years and never notice. You have just spent time with one of the most carefully documented and theologically significant mystical accounts in Padre Pio's entire life. A vision that shaped everything he did in the confessional for the next 46 years, until his death in September 1968. These accounts do not circulate widely. They require careful handling. They require research, context, and a willingness to present them without dramatizing them beyond what the primary sources support. If this channel has given you something real today, something that will change how you pray tonight, or how you examine your conscience before your next confession, or how you think about the people you love whose final spiritual state you hold in quiet uncertainty, then please consider using the Super Thanks button below. It keeps this work alive. It keeps these testimonies reaching the people who need them. And it says, these things are worth knowing. These souls deserve to be remembered. And what Padre Pio learned in that February night of 1922 deserves to be passed on. So what does this mean for how you pray today? I am not going to give you a list of new devotional practices. That would miss the entire point of what Padre Pio saw. The vision was not a call to do more. It was a call to do differently. What it requires is a single shift, one commitment expressed clearly, renewed every day. After the vision of 1922, Padre Pio began recommending to the people he directed a prayer that he described as La preghiera dell'indifeso, the prayer of the undefended. Not a complex prayer. In fact, its simplicity is the point. It goes like this: Lord, I am here. I am not bringing you my spiritual accomplishments today. I am not presenting my devotions as credentials. I am simply here with the whole of what I am, including what I am ashamed of, including what I have been managing, including what I have been too proud to need help with. And I am asking you to have all of it. Not just the part I have organized for you, all of it. Padre Pio told the friars that this prayer, or any prayer that inhabits this fundamental posture, was the single most effective spiritual formation against the condition he had witnessed in the vision. Not because saying certain words creates a magical barrier against damnation, but because the interior act of total surrender, practiced daily over months and years, gradually shapes the soul into a posture that is genuinely capable of the final surrender. It makes surrender familiar, normal, the practiced thing, the habitual thing, rather than the impossible thing. He said, "The soul that has practiced receiving God every day for 20 years will find it easy to receive Him at the end. The soul that has spent 20 years managing God's access to its own interior will find it at the end very hard indeed." This is the personal commitment I'm asking you to make today. Not a new devotion on top of the ones you already have. Not a longer rosary or an additional novena. One shift in the prayer you already say. The shift from presentation to surrender, from managing to receiving, from arriving before God with your spiritual accomplishments arranged carefully in your hands, the masses attended, the rosaries said, the fasts kept, the charities given, and offering them with the implicit expectation of being recognized, to arriving with your hands open and empty and saying, "Here, all of it. I'm not managing the terms today. Take everything." This shift will feel uncomfortable at first. Padre Pio warned about this explicitly. He said that the soul accustomed to managing grace will initially experience surrender as a form of danger, because it has learned over years to associate its spiritual safety with its own careful administration of holy things. The discomfort is not a sign that the prayer is wrong. It is a sign that the prayer is reaching exactly what it needs to reach. Press through the discomfort. Do it again the next day, and the day after that, because what Padre Pio witnessed in that cold February vision was not, when he finally understood it fully, when St. Francis explained what he was seeing and why, primarily a vision of the damned. It was a vision of a possibility that exists for every soul still here, still alive, still choosing, and the choice that forecloses it is not dramatic. It is not a single great sin. It is the accumulated habit of a lifetime of managing God rather than meeting Him. And it can be interrupted today by one prayer, said honestly, with open hands. This changed everything for me when I finally understood it, not the doctrine of hell. I had known that my whole life. What changed was the shape of my own prayer. I realized in my early 50s during a retreat in Wales that I had spent decades being very good at presenting my prayers to God. Very organized, very thorough, faithfully covering all the categories. And a priest said to me during that retreat, quietly, simply, with no drama, "You are managing your relationship with God very efficiently. How would it feel to simply be loved by Him?" I didn't know how to answer. I sat with the question for the rest of the retreat and then for months afterward, and what I discovered, slowly and with some difficulty, was that I genuinely did not know how to receive love that I hadn't somehow earned, and that this specific incapacity was exactly what Padre Pio had seen in that vision, exactly the shape of the soul that finds the final door impossible to walk through. I did not want that to be my story. And that desire, that simple, quiet, frightened desire to not die managing what I should have been receiving, was the beginning of the only real change in my prayer life that has ever actually changed anything. What I want you to understand is that this change does not require dramatic spiritual experiences. It does not require a mystic vision. It does not even require that you feel anything different at first. The change Padre Pio was calling for, based on what he had seen, is entirely accessible to anyone sitting in an ordinary house, in an ordinary town, on an ordinary Tuesday evening. It is the change of posture in prayer from the inside, from presenting to receiving, from managing to needing, from here is what I have done to here is what I am. You do not need to be mystically advanced to make that shift. You need only to decide that you want to make it, and then to make it, imperfectly, today, and again, tomorrow. And to allow that imperfect daily decision, accumulated over time, to shape the soul into something capable of the final surrender. That is the whole of Padre Pio's message from the vision of 1922, distilled to its essential instruction: form the habit of receiving before you reach the moment when receiving is all that remains. And now, before I go, I want to ask you one honest question. In your prayer life right now, not your devotional practice, not your attendance record, not your charitable giving, in the interior life of your prayer, are you presenting or are you receiving? Are you arriving before God with something to offer, or are you arriving before God with nothing at all except yourself? Don't answer me. Answer yourself. And if what you find in that answer is something you want to act on, write the word surrender in the comments below. Not for anyone else's benefit, not as a performance of spiritual seriousness, but because sometimes naming a commitment out loud, even to strangers, is itself the first act of the very surrender it names, and that matters. Padre Pio would say that counts.